Most people think the secret to getting smarter is reading more. More books, more courses, more content. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Two people can spend the same 10 years learning, same hours, same effort, same dedication, and end up in completely different places. One of them can see patterns others miss, make connections that seem obvious but only in hindsight, build on what they already know instead of starting over every time. The other one just has a lot of information they can't quite use. So what's actually different between them? It's not how much they learned, it's how their knowledge was built. Because knowledge doesn't compound automatically. It only compounds when you build it the right way, and most people were never taught how to do that. Benjamin Franklin never went to college. He left school at 10 years old, started working at 12. By his 20s, most people assumed his education was over. But Franklin did something unusual. He built a small group called the Junto, 12 people who met every Friday night, not to socialize, to ask hard questions, share what they'd read, and challenge each other's thinking. Every book Franklin read, he brought into that room. Every idea got tested, pushed back on, refined. What looked like a reading habit was actually a compounding system. Each new thing he learned didn't sit alone. It connected to something already there. By the time Franklin was 50, he wasn't just educated. He was operating on a completely different level than people who had read just as much. Charlie Munger noticed the same pattern from a different angle. He called it a mental lattice. The idea is simple. A single fact sitting alone in your head is almost useless. But the same fact connected to 10 other ideas, that's where the power comes from. Munger spent decades pulling from psychology, biology, economics, history, not because he was trying to know everything, but because he understood that the more connection points you have, the faster new knowledge finds its place. He once said that the people who think with only one model are the most dangerous kind of thinkers, because everything looks the same to them. Marie Curie worked the same way, but almost nobody talks about it in this context. Most people remember her as a physicist, but her Nobel Prize-winning work on radioactivity sat right at the border between physics and chemistry. At the time, physicists and chemists barely talked to each other. They had different languages, different methods, different assumptions. Curie worked in both. And because of that, she could see something neither group could see on their own. The breakthrough didn't come from going deeper into one field. It came from standing at the intersection of two. Richard Feynman had a different problem to solve. He kept noticing that he could follow an explanation perfectly in the moment, and then 2 weeks later, it was gone. So he developed a personal rule. If he couldn't explain something simply, from scratch, without notes, he didn't actually understand it. He had just memorized it. So every time Feynman learned something new, he would sit down and try to explain it like he was teaching a child. Not to be cute about it, but because that process forced his brain to compress, to find the real structure underneath. The things that survived that process stuck permanently. The things that didn't, they were never really knowledge in the first place. Jeff Bezos built something similar into how Amazon made decisions. He required his senior team to write full narratives before any major meeting, not bullet points. Full sentences, full arguments, full logic. Because bullet points let you fake understanding. A sentence that sounds smart in a slide can fall apart the moment you try to write it out completely. Bezos knew that the act of writing forces clarity. And clarity is what lets knowledge accumulate cleanly without noise, without confusion layered on top of confusion. 5 people, different centuries, different fields, different methods. But look at what they all did. None of them just collected information. They each built a system that made every new thing they learned attached to something that was already there. You've probably already guessed it. The difference isn't how much you learn. It's whether what you learn has somewhere to land. Knowledge compounds the same way money compounds. If you put money in a jar, it stays flat. But if you put it somewhere with structure, somewhere it can connect, grow, attach to other things, it starts to multiply on its own. Most people treat their mind like a jar. They pour information in books, podcasts, articles, courses, more every year, and then wonder why, after 10 years of learning, they still feel like they're starting from scratch every time a new problem shows up. It's not because they didn't learn enough. It's because the knowledge never had a structure to attach to. It just sat there, separate pieces with no connection between them. Here's where it gets more uncomfortable. We're living in a moment where the amount of information available to any one person has never been higher. Courses are cheaper than ever. Books are everywhere. You can learn almost anything for free in an afternoon. Which means the gap between people who consume information and people who compound knowledge is about to get much wider, not smaller. AI can already summarize, research, and explain faster than any human. If your edge is knowing facts, that edge is gone. Or it's going. But there's one thing AI cannot replicate. The specific way your knowledge connects. the unique lattice you've built over years of thinking, testing, and making sense of the world. That's not a database, that's a thinking system. And a thinking system is something you have to build deliberately. It doesn't happen just because you read a lot. The people who understood this early, Franklin, Munger, Curie, Feynman, Bezos, they weren't trying to know more than everyone else. They were trying to build something that got stronger the more they added to it. And that's a very different goal. So what does it actually look like to build knowledge that compounds? Not as a philosophy, as a practice. The first shift is learning in clusters, not topics. Most people pick a subject and go through it linearly. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, finish the book, move to the next one. But isolated topics don't compound. They stack up without connecting. Charlie Munger never studied one field at a time. When he was learning about human behavior, he was reading psychology, evolutionary biology, and economic history simultaneously. Not because he was trying to be impressive, but because the connections between those fields were more valuable than any single field alone. When you learn in clusters, pulling 2 or 3 related ideas from different domains at the same time, your brain starts building bridges automatically. The practical version is simple. Every time you finish something, ask yourself, what is one thing from a completely different field that this reminds me of? Write it down. That single habit changes how knowledge settles in your mind. The second shift is compressing what you learn by teaching it. Feynman's technique wasn't just a study trick. It was a filter. When you try to explain something simply, the gaps in your understanding become impossible to ignore. You realize very quickly what you actually know versus what you only recognized when someone else explained it. Recognition is not understanding. And recognized knowledge doesn't compound. It just takes up space. You don't need a classroom to do this. Write a short explanation of something you just learned as if you're sending it to a smart friend who knows nothing about the topic. If you can't do it without going back to your notes, you haven't learned it yet. The third shift is returning to old knowledge with new eyes. Most people treat learning as a one-way road. You learn something, file it away, and move forward. But knowledge changes meaning over time. Something you read at 22 will mean something completely different at 32. Not because the words changed, but because the lattice around it grew. Benjamin Franklin reread and rewrote his own notes constantly, not because he forgot them, but because he knew that an old idea sitting next to a new idea could produce something neither one contained alone. Set a simple rule. Every 30 to 90 days, go back to one thing you learned earlier and ask, what does this mean now, given everything else I've learned since? That single review will often produce more insight than reading 3 new books. The fourth shift is building a decision log. This one is underused almost everywhere. Bezos built decision frameworks at Amazon not just to make better choices, but to create a record of how his team was thinking over time. When you write down a decision, what you chose, why you chose it, what you expected to happen, you're creating data about your own thinking. And your thinking is a system that can compound too. 6 months later, you go back and look. Were you right? Where were you wrong? What did you consistently miss? Most people never do this, so they keep making the same reasoning errors for decades without ever noticing the pattern. A decision log doesn't have to be formal. 3 sentences after any significant choice is enough. What I decided. Why? What I think will happen. Over time, that becomes one of the most valuable documents you own. The fifth shift is protecting the structure, not just adding to it. Here's something counterintuitive. The biggest threat to compounding knowledge isn't learning too little. It's consuming so much, so fast, that nothing has time to connect. Marie Curie worked in long, uninterrupted stretches, not because she was slow, but because deep work was the only environment where connections could actually form. Information consumed in fragments, scrolling, skimming, jumping between tabs fills space without building structure. The practical rule here is simple but hard to follow. For every hour you spend taking in new information, spend at least 30 minutes doing nothing with it. No new input. Just thinking, writing, or sitting with what you already have. That gap is where compounding actually happens. There's a version of you 10 years from now who knows a lot. And there's a version of you 10 years from now who thinks differently than almost anyone around them. Those are not the same person. The first one spent a decade consuming. Books finished, courses completed, content watched. They can tell you what they learned. But when a hard problem shows up, something new, something without a clear answer, they go looking for more information. Because that's the only move they know. The second one spent the same decade building. Not just learning things, but connecting them, testing them, returning to them, letting them change shape as everything else around them grew. When a hard problem shows up, they don't go looking for more input. They go quiet. And they think, because somewhere in the structure they've built, the answer, or at least the beginning of one, is already there. Franklin didn't become one of the most effective minds in American history because he read more than other people. Munger didn't build one of the greatest investment track records of the 20th century because he had access to better information. Feynman didn't win a Nobel Prize because he studied harder than everyone else in the room. They built systems where knowledge didn't just accumulate, it multiplied. And here's the quiet truth underneath all of it. That kind of thinking isn't reserved for geniuses. It's not a talent you're born with. It's a practice, a set of choices about how you engage with what you learn. Every connection you make between two ideas is a small investment. Every time you teach something back to yourself, you're earning a return. Every time you return to something old with new eyes, the interest compounds. Most people are learning, but very few are compounding. The question isn't whether you have enough time to learn. The question is whether you're building something or just filling space. The goal isn't to learn more. It's to learn so that everything connects.